I was recently reading through Ray Dalio's Principles for the Changing World Order when I came across a single line that caught my attention. The book examines historical trends linked to the rise and fall of nations, a topic Dalio, founder of one of the world's largest hedge funds, has spent his life studying. But all this is besides the point. This particular line was just a passing remark, mentioned only once and barely connected to the book's main theme. It could have been cut entirely without changing a thing. And yet it stuck with me more than anything else in the book. Dalio writes, "I believe that if we had a perfect model that took every cause-effect relationship into consideration, we could perfectly forecast the future. That the only thing that stands in our way is our inability to model all those cause-effect dynamics." This idea is absolutely fascinating. The notion that we could reduce the entire universe to an equation, predicting everything with perfect accuracy. In this reality, we would essentially be clairvoyant, which also carries with it some insane implications. But is any of this actually true? Can the universe really be conquered so easily? Or is there something deeper? Something fundamentally unpredictable that no amount of human ingenuity can overcome? Buckle up, it's going to be a long one. Thomas Robert Malthus was an English economist who, in the late 18th century, would cement his legacy as one of history's greatest pessimists. In his Essay on the Principle of Population, he made two simple but ominous observations. Number one, that the amount of arable land on Earth is fixed, and number two, that human population grows exponentially. At the time, the average English couple would have a whopping 5 to 6 children to compensate for the high infant mortality rate. Roughly 1 of every 3 children would die before reaching the age of 5. Given these two facts, Malthus concluded that food production would never keep pace with population growth, leading to inevitable cycles of mass starvation. As populations expanded beyond the available food supply, famine and disease would wipe out thousands, restoring a natural balance, only for the cycle to repeat endlessly. To Malthus, this wasn't just a theory, it was
a mathematical certainty.
The land was finite, population growth was exponential, there was no way around it. And yet, he was wrong. While we've had localized periods of famine due to things like poor weather conditions, political instability, and government inefficiency, his cycles of mass starvation never came true. But why? Malthus was born in the 18th century, when farming was absolutely back-breaking labor. The typical farmer worked 70-plus hour weeks in the fields with little more than a malnourished oxen and a dream. And despite all this labor, crop yields were still low, and the typical European farmer could barely feed a handful of people. As a result, a staggering 75% of the global economy was dedicated purely to agriculture, just to keep people from starving. A single bad harvest could spell disaster for a population, as seen with the Irish potato famine in 1845. Now, contrast that with today, where the problem of food production has essentially been solved. The US alone easily produces enough food to feed the entire world. World hunger has become more of an issue of logistics and political corruption rather than a supply issue. This shift is largely thanks to the Green Revolution, a period of rapid agriculture advancements in the mid-20th century that dramatically increased food production worldwide. Malthus could never have imagined that in the next century we would be altering the DNA of fruits to make them bigger, and raining pesticides down on crops from the heavens. What Malthus failed to account for was innovation, and not just minor gradual improvements, but massive world-altering innovations. Inventions like genetically modified organisms, aircrafts, and the automobile, each of which completely reshaped the world we live in. Events like these are turning points in human history. Their impact is so great that the before and after are unrecognizably different. In failing to predict these types of events, Malthus failed to predict Black Swans. For centuries, it was common knowledge that all swans were white. This was just a fact. No other swan had ever been encountered before, and so it must be that all swans are white. The premise of a non-white swan was so absurd that the phrase Black Swan was used as a metaphor for something impossible. That is, until 1697, when a group of Dutch explorers landed in Australia and discovered, to their shock, black swans. And just like that, a law was shattered. Centuries of common wisdom erased by the mere existence of a single counterexample. Black swans could no longer be symbols of the impossible. Their meaning would have to be redefined. One of those who answered the call was Nassim Taleb, a Lebanese-American statistician and author of the titular Black Swan. Drawing inspiration from the Swan's unexpected discovery, Taleb redefined the term to describe rare, world-altering events that defy expectations and reshape history. According to him, for an event to qualify as a true Black Swan, it must meet 3 key criteria. First, it must have massive, world-altering consequences that reshape industries, societies, or ways of thinking. Second, it wasn't foreseen by experts, analysts, or predictive models. A small minority might have warned about it, but were largely ignored. And third, it must be rationalized in retrospect. After it happens, people must look back at the event and act like it was obvious all along. The signs were all there, how did we not see this coming? To demonstrate this, let's take a look at one of the biggest black swans in recent history, the 2008 financial crash.
I think this is the most significant financial crisis in the post-war period.
For those unaware, the 2008 financial crash was a global economic meltdown caused by the bursting of a massive housing bubble. Banks were handing out mortgages to people who couldn't afford them, fueling a wave of reckless lending that eventually spiraled into disaster. It also triggered the worst global recession since the Great Depression, leading to millions losing their entire savings, jobs, and homes. The US government alone was forced to spend trillions of dollars in bank bailouts and stimulus packages to prevent a total economic collapse. So, extreme impact, check. Additionally, the majority of mainstream economists and financial institutions completely failed to predict the crash. Most had literally never seen house prices fall before and assumed that wouldn't change. The prevailing belief was that house prices always go up and would thus always be a safe investment. And while there definitely was a small subset of people who saw the writing on the wall that lending money to people who had absolutely no way to pay it back was destined to fail, 99% had no idea. If we did, the collapse wouldn't have happened in the first place. So, unpredictability, check. And for retroactive rationalization, look no further than the thousands of pundits on TV or finance bros explaining how the crash was obvious all along. You haven't experienced life until you've had a teenager on the treadmill next to you at the gym explain The Big Short in between hits of his vape. He's probably forgotten me, but I will never forget him. But regardless, we're 3 for 3. Textbook Black Swan. And this is just one example. Black swans are littered throughout history. Events that just blindside us and change the world seemingly overnight. We've come a long way in building models and algorithms that help us make predictions far beyond human intuition. And with AI machine learning continuing to evolve at breakneck speed, this ability is only going to increase. But will it ever be enough to kill the black swan? After all, black swans are by definition the most unpredictable and volatile events we experience. If we can predict the unpredictable, we've essentially reached clairvoyance. So we have our objective, eliminate black swans. Do that and we'll never lose in the stock market again. Sounds great, but this might be easier said than done. Let's take a step back to the man that started all of this. If we recall, Dalio essentially argues that if we could construct a model that perfectly accounted for every single variable, we would be seers, capable of predicting the future with absolute certainty. And intuitively, this makes sense. If every input is known and the model is flawless, how could there be unknowns in the output? This idea isn't anything new either. For centuries, scientists believed the universe operated under strict, predictable laws, leaving no room for randomness or even free will. This belief, called determinism, held that everything, including human behavior, could be reduced to cause and effect, inputs and outputs. The roots of determinism had existed for centuries, but it wasn't until the late 17th century when Isaac Newton cemented it as the foundation of modern science. After all, Newton had shown that everything, from pins to planets, followed precise predictable laws. Given an object's position and velocity, you could calculate exactly where it will be in the future. This sparked a revolution in the scientific community. If motion, gravity, and energy could be broken down into mathematical laws, then why not everything else? For over a century, determinism reigned supreme. The future was not open-ended. If you had enough data, you could predict anything. That is, until a second revolution upended everything. A new discovery, one that would prove Newton wrong and usher the world into a new era. If you had asked anyone in the late 19th or earliest 20th century who the best scientist on the planet was, you would almost certainly get one answer: Isaac Newton. By this point, Newton was almost a godlike figure. He had unlocked the secrets of motion and gravitation, co-invented calculus, and made an absurd number of other contributions that shaped the modern world. His laws stood immutable, having never been disproved in the centuries since their discovery. And yet, despite all of this, something didn't quite add up. In 1859, astronomers noticed an inconsistency in Mercury's orbit. It was slightly off from Newton's predictions, by exactly 43 arcseconds per century, or about 1/100th of a degree every 100 years. Side note, this is one of the biggest reminders of how much we completely underestimate our ancestors. To reach this level of precision before the invention of computers is just mind-boggling. People may have been getting smoked by tuberculosis every day, but they could still measure planetary motion to near perfection with a pencil and paper. But anyways, this seemingly insignificant discrepancy, this rounding error, was a big deal. This was the first time in the 172 years they had existed that Newton's laws had failed. Everything else could be predicted with insane precision, it was just Mercury. At the time, the most obvious explanation was that a hidden, undiscovered planet, nicknamed Vulcan, was interfering with Mercury's orbit. No one even considered that Newton could possibly be wrong. But all of this changed in 1905, when a young Swiss patent clerk named Albert Einstein introduced the world to special relativity. Einstein's theory shattered the foundation of Newtonian physics by revealing something previously unthinkable, that time and space are not fixed. Instead, they bend and distort depending on how fast an object moves. The closer an object gets to the speed of light, the more Newton's laws break down. Which is why Newton never noticed this. In his time, nothing really moved fast enough to reveal it. This also explains why Newton's laws work perfectly for all objects in daily life. The speed of light is unfathomably fast. Everything else is comparatively slow as f***. Even the fastest object Newton had access to, Mercury, which orbits at 48 kilometers per second or over 100,000 miles per hour, is a mere fraction of the speed of light. That's why it took so long for the discrepancy to be discovered. It was so small due to Mercury being so relatively slow. But as we began to enter the 20th century, our focus shifted from giant celestial bodies to the smallest building blocks of the universe, subatomic particles, the things that make up atoms themselves. These fundamental building blocks of nature are, as expected, infinitesimally small. This results in them requiring very little energy to reach staggering velocities. And this is where Einstein's formula became so crucial. These particles move so fast that Newton's laws completely failed to apply to them. Einstein's relativity formulas were the only way to model and predict these subatomic particles. That being said, we can still predict them, right? We can still perfectly model them and thus keep determinism alive. This is what Einstein wanted. He was also a staunch determinist who famously stated that God doesn't play dice. He believed that the whole universe was preordained and followed a fixed path. And yet, ironically, it was Einstein that laid the groundwork for the discovery that would threaten determinism's very existence. It's probably safe to assume that at this point in your life, you're familiar with Schrödinger's cat. It's become such a phenomenon in pop culture that it's basically a meme at this point, alongside things like the trolley problem. But in case you've been living under a rock and somehow haven't heard of it, it goes something like this. A cat is placed in a sealed box. Inside the box, there's a poison capsule that has a 50% chance of disintegrating and releasing the poison. If it does, the cat dies. If not, the cat lives. The big twist is that technically, until you open the box, the cat simultaneously exists in a state of being both alive and dead. I remember hearing this and wondering, what the hell does this even mean? What's the point of this? Well, it turns out that this bizarre thought experiment perfectly models the behavior of subatomic particles. Before they're measured, particles literally don't have definite positions or momenta. And it's not like they exist in a fixed state and we just don't know the answer. No, they quite literally do not exist as particles at all. Instead, they behave as waves, with each point on the wave representing a possible position and momentum value. It's not until we open the box, or measure a particle's position or momentum, that this wave breaks down and it's forced into a definite state. This was first demonstrated through the famous and bizarre double-slit experiment. Imagine a light source shooting light photons toward a screen. In between, there's a metal sheet with two slits. When we don't observe the photons, they create a wave-like interference pattern on the screen, meaning they're acting like waves, not particles. But when we add a detector at the slits, the pattern completely changes. Instead of waves, we just see two distinct marks, as if the photons suddenly decided to behave like particles instead. The simple act of measuring the photons turned them from waves into particles. But how the hell does a particle know when it's being measured? It's almost like they're shy and behave differently when we're watching. That would be funny, but that's not really what's going on here. At a fundamental level, to measure something requires us to interact with it in some way, whether we realize it or not. Take our vision, for example. Human sight begins with a light source, like the sun, emitting light photons. These photons then travel and bounce off objects they come into contact with. When this happens, information about that object is encoded into the particle. How this is done is a whole nother topic, but it's essentially by changing the wavelength of the particle. Finally, said particle reaches our eyes and is processed by our brain into an image. Our sight, and all of our other senses, depends entirely on particles interacting with the world around us. For everyday objects, this isn't an issue. Even the smallest visible objects are millions of times bigger than subatomic particles, meaning these tiny particle interactions don't noticeably affect them. But this is obviously drastically different when measuring a subatomic particle itself. If we bounce a light photon off a particle, we can see it and determine its position, but the photon transfers energy, changing its momentum, like hitting a pool ball and making it move. The same thing is true when measuring a particle's momentum. We have methods of doing so, but the process requires interaction that disturbs its position. You might be able to see the issue here. This fundamental limitation was first proposed by Werner Heisenberg in 1927. His idea, which would become known as the uncertainty principle, states that it's fundamentally impossible to simultaneously know both the precise position and momentum of a particle. If we measure its position, we disturb its momentum. If we measure its momentum, we lose its position. If we measure neither, then the particle doesn't even have definite values, it just exists as a wave of probabilities. This idea, so ridiculous it's hard to even fathom, was a huge blow to determinism. If we can even predict the future of a single particle, then how could we ever predict the entire universe? This discovery was devastating to many classical scientists, especially Einstein, who instead believed that quantum physics was incomplete and that there were variables we weren't considering. He spent the rest of his life denying quantum uncertainty, believing that a new, better theory would come along and prove determinism right in the end. But after nearly a century, Heisenberg's uncertainty principle still stands. Despite countless attempts, no one has been able to disprove it. But if this is such an open and shut case, then why do people still believe the universe is predictable? Why is Ray Dalio still talking about it like we're in the 18th century? Well, despite the evidence against determinism, there are still plenty of holdouts. Several schools of thought have emerged to challenge the concept of free will. For brevity, we'll just take a look at two of the most prominent ones. The first group is what I'll call the Einstein camp, the people who believe that quantum mechanics is simply incomplete. They argue that just as Newton's laws were eventually expanded upon, quantum physics may also have hidden variables we haven't accounted for yet. And this seems reasonable. After all, science progresses every day. Who's to say we won't discover another Black Swan that turns quantum physics on its head? While this is theoretically possible, there's significant evidence against these hidden variable theories. In fact, 3 scientists recently won the 2022 Nobel Prize in Physics for disproving such theories. So, not currently looking good for the Einstein camp. But there's also another camp which can't really be dismissed so easily. This group, let's call them soft determinists, acknowledge quantum uncertainty and its implications, that there is inherent randomness in our universe. However, they argue that since these fluctuations happen at a literal subatomic level, their impact on the real world is negligible, that we can essentially ignore them and make approximations that are 99.999% accurate. And there's a lot of truth to this. After all, everything around us is constantly under the effects of quantum uncertainty, yet we can still almost perfectly predict things like the trajectory of a baseball or the orbits of planets with Newton's laws. But there's a catch to this assumption. Anyone who's seen a time travel movie has probably seen the plot beat where someone in the past, trips on a rock and goes back to a future where Hitler won the war. This is the butterfly effect, the idea that even the smallest changes to the past can have unforeseen consequences on the future. I always thought this was just a trope in movies, but it's actually a staple of chaos theory, and has plenty of empirical evidence supporting it. In chaos theory, a system is considered chaotic if small differences in initial conditions lead to exponentially different outcomes over time. The weather, for example, is a chaotic system. Small variations in temperature, humidity, and wind patterns add up exponentially over time to create wildly varying outcomes. Thus, weather reports become increasingly unreliable the further out we try to predict. So while we can predict a baseball or even a rocket ship's movement to near perfection, we can't even predict the damn weather forecast past 10 days. But that doesn't mean we're completely in the dark. We have a general idea of what Texas summers are like based on past data. What we can't do is predict the exact temperature in Dallas on July 10th, 2030. We might be able to estimate a range, say between 86 and 106 degrees Fahrenheit with a 95% certainty. But what about the other 5%? That sliver of unpredictability is where black swans live. The rare, unexpected events that break all our fancy models and confidence intervals. If all we can do is estimate, then we're not in control. The black swan has won. This is, at least in my mind, the nail in the coffin of determinism. The combination of subatomic randomness and the exponentially amplifying butterfly effect creates a level of unpredictability that fundamentally limits long-term forecasting. No matter how much data we have, the future will always have surprises. But maybe that's not such a bad thing. Uncertainty is what makes life interesting. Whether our choices are truly our own or just illusions, the act of deciding, the ability to fail, to learn from our mistakes, is what gives life meaning. A world without decisions, without responsibility, might as well be a world without life. And who knows, maybe I'm just another Thomas Malthus, someone who in a few centuries will be looked back on with a knowing grin as some great invention revolutionizes quantum physics and chaos theory. If that happens, I too will have fallen victim to the Black Swan. But what do you think? Do you believe we'll ever be able to truly predict the future? Do you believe in free will, or is everything already predetermined? As always, let me know in the comments. I'm always interested to hear y'all's opinions on this. And if you like this video and want to see more, you should totally like and subscribe. Thanks so much for watching, have a great day, and until next time.